It's always nice to be here. We have new Zoom helpful things that describe what's happening. That was helpful. So yeah, I always kind of build these little topics off things that are going on around me. And today we were dealing with some crises, and a crisis particularly for one person. And I think it's always a good reminder to think about, okay, what do we do in this situation? Because inevitably and unfortunately, these things do happen in all our lives. And so it's really to just do some basic ideas tonight about crisis intervention, what it is and what it isn't. I think the single most important thing to realize when you're dealing with a crisis, you're trying to help someone in a crisis, is that everything needs to be present tense. This is not a time to drill into history or look at the whys or how did this happen or how did I get to this place, but really to deal with the moment, the here and now. And that means kind of stabilizing the situation. It means making sure people are safe, whether it's physically or emotionally. It's making sure that they have the support they need. And it's just dealing with what is going on right here in the present. And sometimes when we're in that kind of crisis mode ourselves, it can be very disorienting, it can be very confusing, and there may not be somebody around who can do sort of crisis intervention with us. And so I think it's really important to kind of have tools ourselves that can help us at least get through until help arrives to manage us. So I just wanted to go over some basic stuff. I think all of these we've talked about at some point or another, but I think it's always worth a repeat. One is perhaps not an in the moment kind of thing, but I think it really helps when those moments happen. And that's the whole idea of mindfulness and meditation. If we do that on a regular basis, it really is a skill. It's like a muscle that we would train for in the gym. By doing mindfulness every day, which is simply just spending some time and noticing, being present in your body, being present in your mind, watching where your mind goes, watching what you're seeing and feeling, and just being aware of it, and being aware of it without judging it, without saying, oh, that's stupid, or that's not that again, or what an idiot, or whatever the self-talk, the negative self-talk is that we give ourselves. Just kind of try to let that drop and just be present and notice. And those skills are really tremendously important in a crisis because it can help us kind of get through the hysteria and some of the ways that our minds can kind of spin off track, and it helps keep us centered. It's a skill. It's a grounding skill, we call it. It allows us to benefit and really focus on the present moment without criticizing ourselves, without judging ourselves, without falling into some kind of thought pattern that's not particularly helpful to get us through a crisis. It just really helps us keep clear-headed and focused on what's going on. And oftentimes when we're in those modes, our brain kind of takes off. We're in a fight or flight crisis response mode, and this really does help calm the waters. Some other things. We've mentioned this before, but I wanted to mention it again. Grounding with the five senses, I think, is a really important skill. Grounding skills are just important anyway, because what they mean simply just as they sound, it helps kind of get us back attached to the ground, back so we're feeling grounded and safe and secure, like our feet are on solid earth, as opposed to when we can be in a crisis mode and kind of start to get kind of flighty and kind of lose our base, lose our grounding. So this exercise is a really cool thing. It's basically doing 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, but it's different things. So the pattern is 5 things that I can see. So in any given moment, 5 things I can see. I can see a setting sun. I can see a picture frame. I can see my computer screen. It just gets us right back here in the moment. So it's kind of, okay, it helps me focus on, like, instead of out there, all the what ifs and all the ways that we can catastrophize and kind of go off the rails. It also, okay, what's around me? What's here in this room? So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch. I can touch my keyboard. I can touch the lamp. I can touch my pen. Okay, we can just go 5 things we can see, 4 things we can touch, 3 things we can hear. What do you hear? I hear a fan running. I hear maybe a car outside, whatever it may be. So 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell or like to smell, in case So maybe the smell of coffee in the morning, um, or some kind of favorite food being cooked. Anything that, it doesn't have to be in the moment that, but it's recurring the imagination. And every time we touch a different sense, it actually deepens what's happening. It helps us further ground ourselves because every sense uses a different part of our brain. And we're sort of building this kind of broad-based connection of grounding using the senses. And then the last one thing you can taste. Um, or there's an alternative. You can do one thing that you like about yourself or something like that, one thing. But I like this. I like to stick with the senses. So to review that, it's 5 things you can hear, 4 things you can touch. Sorry, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell or like to smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And so this does a couple of things, right? It really sort of forces us to think about what's right in our environment around us. It really kind of refocuses our mind back to the present. But it also, as a kind of a secondary thing, it allows us to be distracted from whatever the worry is, because as much as we would like to believe it, we can't really multitask as human beings. We do rapid switching between different tasks. So if I'm concentrating on 5 things of this and 4 things of that, it's my mind is actually getting off the thing that's upsetting me so much. Only temporarily, but it really does help calm the waters. So that's the 5 senses grounding. Other kinds of breathing I really like. We've talked about 4-7-8 again, but I'll refer to it here one more time. 4-7-8 breathing, if you just imagine a metronome, just going beat, 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 beat. You inhale for a count of 4, you hold for a count of 7, and you exhale for a count of 8. So you're doing a relatively rapid inhale for 4, hold for 7, and then a long, slow exhale. And if you do that several cycles, even 4 cycles, it has this kind of wonderful quality of being able to kind of just calm your physiology down a little bit. And what's great about it is you can do it at a stoplight, you can do it at a meeting, you can do it on the phone, and it's very subtle. So nobody really knows you're doing it, but it's very effective. So do remember 4-7-8 breathing. Other kinds of breathing, by the way, inhaling and exhaling. Just inhale deeply, hold, exhale deeply, hold. The problem with that is that people often don't do it long enough. To have that kind of breathing have an impact or be effective, you usually have to do it for 2 or 3 minutes at least, those kind of long, slow patterns. And that also will change your physiology. So the other thing too, just if you're available, someone's really having bad times. We see this sometimes with trauma, when you're working on trauma or other kinds of crisis where people are sort of starting to dissociate or disconnect. If you're with someone like that, it's very, very helpful to ask them to just calm down for one thing, but to open their eyes and to make eye contact with you. And that's a thing the therapists do when people are extremely upset. It's very grounding to just make eye contact with someone. You don't have to say anything, you just look into their eyes. And therapists add to that sort of soothing language and other kinds of things. But it really is very, when we're feeling disoriented, especially what do we do when we're panicked? We tend to close our eyes and go off into our heads. And so I think just opening your eyes and making eye contact and holding a steady gaze is very therapeutic for people. And it kind of reorients them to what's happening around them. So there's other things too. I could go on forever about this, but when we are learning how to self-regulate for different kinds of shock responses. So if we go into a fight or flight mode, which is called sympathetic arousal, everything kind of gets heated up. We get flush, we're ready to fight or flight, and our stomach kind of it turns off, which is why amphetamines, which create this as well, reduce appetite. We're not thinking about food in those moments. But what is helpful for those, because it's a very hot response, sometimes cool. I'll have clients drink a swig of cold water. And at those moments when they're kind of dissociated, just the sensation of water going down their esophagus can really help reconnect them to their bodies. And it just kind of reorients them, that sensation. Alternatively, if you're not in fight or flight, but rather the freeze side of a shock response, where everything kind of gets cold and frozen and you get disconnected from your feelings, I have found very often that warmth is a really soothing sensation. So I'll have somebody have a drink of a swip of hot tea. Or in my office, I have these little things you can heat up in the microwave, like little belly buddies, they're called, where you heat them on the microwave and hold them against your stomach or hold them against your chest, and it really is warming. So just these different little tricks to kind of help regulate yourself when you're in these modes can really, really make a huge difference. And I think very, very calming and soothing when we are in these crises that unfortunately a lot of us drop into once in a while. So the other thing then too is just to, once you kind of regulate yourself, is to really reach out for help, call for help, ask for help if it's not around you and available. Those are the moments when we need to go through any shame we have or any embarrassment or any of that, and just really reach out. And we need to get in the habit of reach out. That needs to be a muscle memory response for any addict or partner, so that when we get triggered like that, we don't have to invent a solution. We know what to do off the bat. So I think with that, I'll stop. But some handy crisis tools. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. Everybody ask questions in the Q&A feature. We've got several in there already, which I'm going to get to in a second, but I have been collecting some questions for the last week, David, because they keep coming up in my groups online.
Okay.
And I think they kind of fit crisis mode a little bit. So I'll leave that to you. But
okay.
A bunch of guys in our alumni group on Monday that I hosted, and then also in my support group, the support and accountability group that I host, have had the same issue. They do check-ins with their wives. These are recovering male addicts. They do check-ins with their wives or partners. And part of it is saying how they feel or what they did today, and they're trying to be honest, and so they can establish some intimacy. And they'll say, you know, I had a crummy day today, and I'm feeling disconnected and inadequate or something, whatever they say. And then their wife or partner will take that and start to make up stories about why the addict is feeling that way, and kind of spin off into, you don't love me, you're blaming me for everything, or, you know, I don't believe you, you're making that up, or you're feeling this way because you acted out, or you're getting ready to act out, and things that aren't true. And it's very, very frustrating for the addicts who are really genuinely trying to connect, to have their partner take an honest answer and spin it into something that's really not real. So is that, I guess I'll ask it a crisis question, is that part of the betrayal trauma, which creates crisis, particularly early on? But what about later on? You know, this seems to spin from crisis, but it also seems to spin into crisis.
Right.
So I don't know what my question is, but you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think any partner and addict kind of already have a pretty well-worn dance they do, I think, right? They get into habits and routines and jump to conclusions when one starts to speak, and so I think there's a very high speed process that's going on, and sometimes people take a few words and jump to a conclusion or overgeneralize and as you say, tell a story or get off the rails. I think part of that is really just going to be effective communication. One of the most effective ones I know of, I've mentioned here before, is imago therapy dialogue, where they actually really slow it down. And so, and I think this would be a helpful situation in the kind of circumstance you're talking about, where, you know, if I say, I think the sky is blue, you know, before you come back at me and say, well, no, it's red or whatever, but you say, I heard you say, I think the sky is blue. And just right off the bat, it slows it down, and you can see if the message that I just sent was received accurately. And very often it's not, and because we hear different things, we interpret different things, we read into just kind of what you're saying, we read into the statement something that wasn't there. And so I think those kind of dialogue processes, they're a little bit contrived, I guess, because they slow it down, but just repeating, okay, I heard you say, did I get that right? and say, no, you didn't. I actually said, X, Y, Z. So, and you repeat it. And finally, when it gets right, then you can go on to the next phase, which is, well, gee, I heard you say this, and I can understand how you would feel that way. It's some kind of connection, empathy, understanding going that way. So it builds, but I think just kind of learning some communication skills to slow it down really helps eliminate a lot of that extra stuff. Because when that happens, that creates just something else to react to, right? And it can grow and expand and kind of mushroom very quickly into something else. So I think just slowing down the communication and the repeating if necessary to make sure that what I actually said was heard. Now they may not agree with it, but at least they know what I intended to say. But I think part of that too, to get to the kind of a deeper point, I think when we've gone through the trauma of living with an addict and being gaslighted and trying to get the truth, and it's that whole process kind of speeds up our line of reasoning or thinking or jumping to conclusions. And so I think that's a habit that's hard to stop, but I don't think it's particularly helpful when you're trying in early recovery or in any recovery to kind of work these things through, because it creates room for a lot of misinterpretation or misunderstanding. I think just slowing the whole thing down is probably the best solution for that.
Yeah, imago therapy sounds like sort of a formal couples therapy version of grounding techniques and mindfulness and breath work almost. Just slow it down and get back in the moment and sort of reality check. And
right. And also that same thing I mentioned for some of those, for the mindfulness particularly, as to be non-judgmental about it. Just to, okay, this is what it is, not reading too much into it, not over-interpreting, not under-interpreting either, not ignoring something, but just kind of being taking what you have in front of you as straightforward as you can make it and accept it.
Thank you. Now I can refer guys to the video of this. I can say, here's your answer, Dr. David.
Okay,
okay, second question, and I think we've had this question on here before, but it's worth asking again. A lot of the guys, they're in recovery, they're rebuilding trust with their wives or partners, and both sides are ready to be sexually intimate again. And then when the addicts try to be sexually intimate, things don't work. And I suggested, well, that's okay. You can still be emotionally intimate, and you can do things that are sexual that don't involve genital intercourse and things like that. But how common is this, and what techniques can couples use, and particularly addicts use, male addicts, to work their way back toward sexual performance in the way that they might like to perform?
Yeah, I think that scenario you just described,
because it's upsetting to both the addict and the partner.
Oh yeah, it's very common. And when you think about it, most people probably haven't had a lot of sexual contact or intimacy at a kind of deep and somewhat scary level, perhaps, without the filters and barriers of some addictive process. So a lot of the people I work with who are chemsex users are used to having sex with a lot of drugs and alcohol that disinhibit and soothe, and you're not feeling very much, and it's kind of altering your mood and your sensation, including your anxiety, your fear, your worry that it's not going to work right. And so when we're approaching sex sober, whether it's from drugs or alcohol or without sex addiction or fantasy so much, then yeah, things are very real. And I think there's that added stress or anxiety that is it going to work or not, and what's it going to be like, and is he or she going to be satisfied, and all of that tension and stress can really start to undermine our ability to perform. It really does ruin it. And so I think the best strategies for that, and it's very common, are to really start to reconnect in a way that takes the pressure off. And we've talked about this probably every week. Sensate Focus by Masters and Johnson is one of those exercises that starts out non-sexual, where you're using physical contact to kind of reconnect. And I think the reason that works so well is that when we are in the middle of any kind of addiction, but especially a sex addiction, we're using fantasy to drive the whole thing. And sex addiction and porn addiction and chemsex are all so dependent on these really high, super stimulating things that it just hijacks that system, as we've talked about before. And so it hijacks it so high that normal stuff doesn't arouse us anymore. We're dependent on that high levels of fantasy. Now that changes with recovery. Our minds start to come back down to earth, if you will. But I think if we're trying to have a fantasy that competes with the power of the addiction fantasy, there's no such thing. So I think my point here is that I think it's really hard to get aroused in recovery through a fantasy portal, if you will, through that technique. What I recommend, and this is why Sensate Focus works so well, I think to just reconnect, to just hold each other, to do a massage, do some stroking, some physical contact, but not necessarily sexual. And I believe our bodies know how to respond. If we are relaxed enough and content and connected with somebody and having that physical response, there will be a physiological response that builds towards sexuality. So I think it's just a matter of kind of not trying to match, do things the old way by going through our heads in fantasy, but really letting our bodies take the lead in building this sensual arousal. And I think that will happen. And it's a matter of trusting our bodies, being comfortable enough. And it may not happen the first time because there's also kinds of awkwardness and sex and intimacy if we're used to doing it under the influence of some addictive behavior, it's going to be pretty intense and scary at first. But I think as we get more comfortable with it, if we can just connect physically, connect emotionally with that intimacy, I think that's going to go a long way towards solving that problem, basically.
And, once the brain resets and when you're doing this work, do some people still need to do some, trauma work for sexual trauma and sexualized shame that they're carrying from early in life, which is pretty much what probably drove the addiction in the first place?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So, as we've talked about before, our addictions are really the way we coped with stuff. They were maladaptive coping mechanisms, but they function in our lives to either keep things at bay or to let us work through things despite of, a history of trauma or fear, whatever. We could function sexually by just getting, high enough or in an emotional enough state. But that's not the way we want to carry on life. So I think to really, in many cases, to be able to really connect with people at an intimate level, it's really important for us to work on all those things that were maybe barriers to that. And a lot of that includes different kinds of abuse and certainly sexual abuse, but other kinds of abuse can have the same effect. That wasn't particularly sexual, but emotional abuse or physical abuse can also create kind of psychological scars that need to be addressed in order to really help us feel safe enough and vulnerable enough to connect with somebody at an intimate level with the trust that we need to make that all work. Yeah.
Thank you. We always say sex addiction isn't about sex, but I also think sex isn't about sex. Sometimes there's so much more at play. So thank you for addressing that.
And it's a very fragile process. There's so many things that can go wrong, or barriers and a lot of that has to do with our histories and our baggage and our things we are aware of or maybe not aware of. And so, yeah, I think it takes time, it takes work. We have those things to face those things in our past to really take some courage and good therapy sometimes too. So, yeah.
Okay, well, let's get to the Q&A.
Okay.
When is a good time to decide if a person wants to stay in or leave the marriage? Not
in early recovery, for one thing. So yeah, that's a good question, and one that's I guess easy and difficult to answer at the same time. I think one of the things that happens when people get into recovery is that the veil is lifted. And this is for either the partner or the addict, and they're starting to see things in a new way. They're starting to see things in a new light. They're they're aware of a lot of more things. And I think that can be somewhat overwhelming in terms of the information they're getting and the extent of their dissatisfaction. I think I've had clients who sometimes think, my God, life is running out. I got to make this change or jump out of this thing fast or get into something fast. I would just encourage everybody to slow it down, because anybody in early recovery, this is whether you're the partner or the addict, you're a work in progress and you're in motion. And so the decisions you make, at 30 days are going to be a very different thing than they would be at 6 months or even a year. And this includes, by the way, not just getting out of a relationship, but getting into a relationship, any kind of major decision, quitting a job, which is a relationship as well, making major changes. It's just not recommended, because what you decide to do early on is, I can almost guarantee, is going to be very different than the decision you would make later. And so I recommend a year. And that's kind of the kind of folklore of that as well. So really make a year before major decisions. Now, if you're in a really uncomfortable marriage, that may seem like a very long time. But I would propose that a really uncomfortable marriage can change a whole lot in the first year of recovery, if there's some healing and recovery that goes on. So I wouldn't jump to it. And despite the urge to do so, I think that impulsivity can only get us in trouble. So I would certainly wait to go in or out of a relationship, to go in or out of a job, to make any kind of major changes. We often have people, another one that we don't mention as much, but it happens a lot. People come into treatment and kind of miracles occur. They're enamored with the process and they want to become a therapist. They want to chuck their job and become a therapist. Great. Actually, that's how I became a therapist that same way. This is a second career, but I did it after a couple of years of recovery. So I think it really takes, you have to kind of wait and be patient. And that's a beautiful thing, but you don't want to just chuck everything that you've known out in the first month and make a jump like that.
Yeah, this is like a crisis related question. When we're in crisis in the heat of the moment, we don't tend to make very good decisions. Our thought process is muddled. We've got a one-track mind. We've got blinders on. We're not considering everything. We act on our emotions. That is not a good time to make a decision about anything. That's not a good time to make a decision about what you want to have for lunch, let alone whether you want to stay in a marriage. In his book, Out of the Doghouse, Dr. Rob talks about just what David said. And he says a year is a good time. And he says sometimes couples balk at that because it seems like too long. So he says, okay, well, let's put the relationship in safe harbor, is the term he uses, for 6 months, and then we'll revisit. And usually after 6 months, they're ready to extend for another 6 months. Right. So if you're struggling to wrap your head around a year, try 6 months and revisit. So.
And renew.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say too, that at any point, I think in recovery, I'm many years in recovery, and I still, I always seek feedback on any major decision I'm going to make, because I don't quite trust myself on my own, because I still have some skewed thinking, I think. And so I think always get feedback, have people you talk to, process these things, sometimes over process them. I think women tend to do that much better than men. Men tend to kind of just jump to it and say, oh, I'll do this, I'll deal with it. And women kind of talk it out at much greater length with their friends. I think men could take a great lesson from that and start to do that same process. Probably result in better decisions.
Okay, do meditation / neurofeedback meditation bands that help with enhancing brain calm also help with managing sex and porn addiction?
So this is interesting. Anything like that has contact can be a tool and an aid. We're starting storm season here where I live, and my poor dog is having really bad days right now, and they have those like thunder shirts and things that help calm. And I think there's any kind of sense of being contained, and even the small, like a bracelet or a band, does some of that same sensation. And so I think they're generally beneficial for kind of grounding and calming, feeling like you're grounded and safe. They do help that sense of meditation. Now, do they help with managing sex and porn addiction? I think generally, yes. I don't know of any specific purpose they have or directly relevant besides their qualities of kind of calming. I just think if you're in a grounded state, you're making much better decisions. You're much less influenced by triggers and cravings. You can bring yourself back to center more quickly and easily if you get kind of thrown off by something. So I think in that general way, they're definitely helpful. I don't think there's any kind of magic to them, though, that you're going to eliminate cravings or anything like that with them. But I think they just generally help people stay connected and grounded and in a clear-headed space where they can deal with stuff as it comes up related to their addiction. So I think they certainly can't hurt, but I think they do help in certain circumstances, absolutely.
Next one here. How do you get the addict to stop writing negative stories into everything? Recently, during an intimate moment, my sex addicted spouse had an episode of PE. David, what is PE?
I'm not sure.
Can you help us out with what PE is? Can you just type that in the chat feature for me? I'm going to skip this question for a minute until we know what PE is. So I'm going to go to the next one and then we'll come right back. I promise. Thank you both so much for all you do. I am a betrayed partner of a sex addict, porn addict who has been sober for a little over a year and now is moving into recovery. I started to focus on my own healing and I realized that I'd experienced gradually increasing anxiety and trauma through multiple discoveries and a 3-year relapse prior to where we are now. I finally feel like I am better managing the anxiety and trauma. I wake up and have extended periods of time where I feel relaxed and anxiety free. I feel such relief and gratitude for these moments, but I also feel like small things, not even always related to the betrayal, can set off the anxiety. Is this sensitization? Is this normal?
Great question and great observation too. And I think I'm so glad you're starting to have some periods of extended time when you're not feeling that anxiety and trigger. I think, yeah, what you're experiencing, when we have any kind of trauma or bad experiences, it may not even rise to the level of trauma, but they become deeply kind of anchored in our brains, and they can be kind of form chains. When I'm doing EMDR trauma therapy with somebody, we know that traumatic memories kind of start to line up in these channels, and that the miracle of EMDR is if you can resolve one of those, they tend to resolve all of them down that particular channel of memories and trauma. So I think in the same way, little things can be triggering that may not even be directly related to the original trauma or distress. For an example, very often with trauma, we have physiological symptoms, right? We maybe get a racing heart or a tightness in our chest or sort of a churning stomach or something like that. And that by the way, may be the first indicator that you're starting to have some kind of reaction. I've had people that were runners who would hit a certain point in their stride and their heart would beat a certain way, and it would remind them of the way it did when they were experiencing some kind of trauma, and that was a trigger. So we have physiological triggers, so almost anything can trigger these old feelings. I would say time is a huge healer for these, but I also know just from seeing a lot of clients over the years that time isn't really sufficient in and of itself to kind of heal those. I think really some kind of trauma therapy where you can have actually some resolution of those as opposed to kind of letting them go dormant can really be helpful. And I've seen it, and I can tell you it is possible to kind of work those things through where they no longer trigger you anymore. But our anxiety and our trauma is kind of always looking for a trigger, and sometimes things that we don't even realize were related to that can become related to that and trigger that trauma. So I just, what I spoke about the very first thing tonight, mindfulness, I think mindfulness is a huge tool to identify these things, to be aware. And the key to these, by the way, and it sounds like you're kind of doing this intuitively, but the key to these is to catch it early and deal with it, as opposed to kind of letting it grow. We tend to kind of sometimes avoid thinking about these things or becoming aware of them or not dealing with it. But the longer we let it kind of fester, the bigger it's going to get. So I think really becoming as alert and aware of your body and your mind your feelings as you can is going to be really helpful, because you can catch these things early on and address them directly and process them and release them. Or employ, steps to counteract them, like some of the things we talked about tonight.
And just to tack on to what David said, in addition to being an addict, I deal with PTSD and anxiety. And there are days like you when I wake up and I feel great. I'm the right person in the right place at the right time, and I'm incredibly grateful for those days. But there are also days where I wake up and I want to jump out of my skin. So I have a morning routine for good days and bad days. I do the same routine every morning. I check in, I do a little meditation, I do a gratitude list. I ask God for help with my day, and it kind of grounds me. It's a grounding experience for me every morning. And sometimes, by 11 o'clock, I have to go back into my room. I have a specific chair. There's no technology in my bedroom. And I sit in that chair with the door closed, and the cat's locked out, so they can't bug me. And I do it again. I restart my day again. So I encourage you to have a routine where you can ground yourself with techniques that work. And a lot of times I'll do 4-7-8 breathing as part of my routine, particularly if I'm having high anxiety. So
that's a great way, and I'll use that same thing, Scott. My morning routine I do no matter where I'm at. So if I'm home, I do it. If I'm in Los Angeles, I do it. And I could be traveling anywhere, which normally would kind of be a little unnerving or ungrounding. But if I have that routine every day, I'm good. I feel like I'm in my own skin in my own life, no matter where I am geographically. So it's a great technique, that regularity.
Okay, so let's back up to the previous question. P is premature ejaculation. I learned something today. There we go.
Okay, I should have known that.
So how do you, we're talking about sex. How do you get the addict to stop writing negative stories into everything? Recently, during an intimate moment, my sex addict spouse had an episode of premature ejaculation. When I brought it up, his reply was, "It happened because we don't have sex frequently enough." This happened 3 years ago as well, and led to discovery of an affair and porn addiction. Recently, I found text messages containing his name to his phone about male enhancement pills, and also a text from a Facebook hookup. All he said was random. Now he is turning his premature ejaculation onto me and saying I think he is bad in bed. I should go find someone that can satisfy me, and that he won't ask me for sex because now he knows I don't want to have sex with him. This is so dysfunctional and toxic. What is the reason for this blaming, delusion, and denial? A lot packed into that.
Yeah, great question, great observation. So I think the bottom line is shame, embarrassment, fear, all that on his part, and these are defenses. One of the things, and it's not a good sign when we see addicts being defensive, blaming. Now that's a classic move. Well, we don't have sex because you've gained weight, or we don't have sex because you're critical, or whatever. But it's dealing with kind of projecting blame onto somebody else for issues that they're experiencing. So I think part of this, when I could talk all night about sexual dysfunction, but sex addiction really causes a whole lot of problems, including problems getting erection and all kinds of sexual functioning issues that are kind of related to these super stimulants and our arousal template getting hijacked and all that. It has nothing to do with the partner, but that's kind of where the blame ends up. And so I think this is what I see in this. And if this were my client, I talk about his own fears, his own shame, maybe his own guilt, and what's going on with that, and how he handles that, and maybe bringing that back home instead of projecting blame onto somebody else. Like, what can we do about it? And really, sometimes, honestly, there's no blame to be had, because these things happened, and I think it's not a matter of someone causing something or blaming something, but this can happen. This is one of the things that is difficult about sex in recovery, because sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes things, and by the way, that can open up the room for laughter and having fun, which is what sex should be, right? Sometimes things don't work, so just you laugh about it, you move on, you do what you need to do. But I think people can get overly serious about it. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. It's dysfunctional. It's toxic. I think sometimes we there's a whole set of things called cognitive errors that are useful to know about, like in a situation like this. One of them is catastrophizing. When something happens to us, we just take it all the way to the 100th power of catastrophe, or we jump to conclusions, or we have black and white thinking, or we rationalize. There's a whole bunch that we project. There's a whole bunch of those things, but I see some of those. It's like a case study in cognitive errors. But I think just to really try to keep it clean. If this happens, I would not react to it. I think don't take it on. This is not your problem. They just really need to take a look at it and get rid of any shame or guilt and process what's really going on. And that's where the solutions come from, not from escalating kind of the negative feelings. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this goes right back to the question, one of the questions I asked earlier with guys who really, want to be sexual with their wives and they're struggling and it hurts both parties. And, and I think a lot of times with addicts, sexual shame leads to sexual dysfunction sometimes, and then sexual dysfunction creates more sexual shame, which leads, it can become a really vicious cycle. And I like what David said about, just acknowledge it and say, oh, you're 17 again. Look at that. And kind of move on and find a way to be intimate without putting a lot of pain into the failed sexual genital sex. But it's very hard when particularly for an addict who's feeling that shame, to not want to lash out and push the shame onto someone else. I mean, that's a really common reaction to feeling shame, is to push it onto someone else somehow.
Absolutely. And this, by the way, would be a great circumstance where you could move more toward that touch and physical contact, and just not trying to focus so much on performance and erections and ejaculations, but to really focus on contact, holding, stroking, just being held, touch. Those kinds of things are extremely soothing, and probably just what is required in a situation like this, just to calm everybody down. But and also, ironically, can very often lead to the things you're trying to get to anyway in terms of performance. So, yeah.
Okay, so the next one here: what is an addict to do when he is in full recovery, no slips or relapses, working his program fully for a year and a half, but his spouse continues diving into metadata from his acting out period every 3-ish weeks, bringing out details and spinning into crisis mode, really wanting to know the answers? Before I turn this over to David, on Friday of this week, and probably Friday 2 weeks from now, I definitely will be doing a webinar with Matt Wheeler at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. But this Friday, we are going to be talking about disclosure, and this will probably leak over into his session 2 weeks from this Friday. So tune in or check out the YouTube channel for Matt Wheeler's stuff on disclosure. We're just going to do a long Q&A. I've got a bunch of questions for him. He's going to answer them. And I think, I don't know if you've done disclosure yet, but every 3 weeks or so, bringing details out and spinning into really wanting to know the answers. I'm guessing your partner feels like she doesn't know all the answers yet, and maybe it's because there hasn't been a disclosure. Okay, David, yours.
No, that's great to know.
That's my big plug.
Yeah, okay. There's always, any talk about disclosure is really important and helpful, because people have a lot of there seems to be some mystery about it, which there shouldn't be. So what I read into this is, right, a partner who's hungry for information, and not for the sake of having information, but for the sake of soothing, to seek safety, to seeking emotional safety in the face of anxiety, uncertainty, and when we don't know something, we tend to fill it in the gaps ourselves. And that we just spoke about some of these cognitive errors. Catastrophizing is one. So I assume, if I don't know something, I assume the worst, and I kind of fill in all the details with what I think might have happened, or my worst fantasy. And that's a really terrible terrible strategy, because you just really work yourself up, and most of the stuff you're imagining probably haven't occurred. So I think if this is a long time to be in recovery, I assume there's a disclosure, but there's not. If there hasn't been, there certainly that's something that would be planned here. But my point here is that partners seek these information metadata in order to try to get to finally know what's going on, and this is usually based on a long history of gaslighting and lying and not being truthful and dripping disclosures, a little bit at a time, all that. So it makes perfect sense as a strategy. It's like, okay, I want to know everything. And so a lot of partners become like super detectives going through stuff. The problem with it, in my opinion, is that when you're really trying to stop the anxiety that you're feeling, the nervousness, the uncertainty, and you're trying to do that through information, in my experience, there's never enough information to really make you feel resolved. And so even if you have everything, if you think there's more, it's going to be driving you crazy. You're going to be looking for it. And so I think the informational gathering strategy isn't always the kindest thing for a partner to do, because they can make themselves nuts with it. And there may be something that doesn't even exist they're insisting on finding. So I think a disclosure where it's all out on the table, where sometimes even polygraphs are used to try to make sure this is a fresh, clean start. That's the best way to do it. What we don't obviously recommend is this kind of dripping disclosure where a little bit comes out here and there, which is incredibly painful and traumatic, actually. So I think to get it out in a formal way, in a structured way, and then after that, at some point, I think the partner has to just sort of watch deeds and watch what's, not the words so much, but what is happening. Is there integrity in what the addict is doing? Are they doing what they say they'll do? Are they showing up when they say they'll show up? Or if there's little spot tests or mechanisms to keep the person on track, are those all lined up without incident? So I think after a while, it just takes time. But I think this is a long time to have this kind of torture for the partner. So I think whatever needs to be done in terms of disclosure to get it straightened out, it's long overdue, I think, in this case.
Okay, next question. In your opinion, when a man is looking at same-sex images, does that mean he's comparing himself because he feels inadequate, or does deep down he have some same-sex attraction? And then I'm going to skip down a little bit. Does it have to do with the first image he saw when young that started his porn addiction? So what causes I'm assuming a supposedly straight man to look at same-sex images?
Right. This is something that's really, really confusing for a lot of people, especially a lot of wives. It is not uncommon for self-identified, heterosexual men in the course of their addiction, and probably outside of it, sometimes to have sex with other men. This kind of surprised me at first as a gay man. I thought these guys must be gay or wanting to be gay or conflicted about being gay. And with the more experience, the more reading I did on it, with certain guys who are escalating their addiction, because we're all seeking dopamine and dopamine kicks in our sexual addiction and any addiction, really. After a while, there's something very important about novelty and even taboo, crossing barriers, taboo, kink. But I found that there's a lot of guys end up, for whatever reason, having occasional sex with men, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily gay. And so I know this is kind of confusing for people at first, but part of it has to do, I think, with the escalation of the addiction, kind of branching out into different kinds of erotic tastes, the kind of thrill of things that might be taboo or different or new, and just kind of this expansion. Now, are there people that are bisexual or gay and haven't really come out? Yeah, I mean, that happens too. But what I tend to look at is the history. Is this behavior that has happened as they've gotten, as their addiction has escalated and grown, or is this something that maybe is a long-standing pattern that goes back even to days before they were really an addict? And in that case, then I think it's a a more substantial issue with sexual orientation and attraction. But I think it's really hard to say. And I think it just takes some time. This is one of those things we often get where people in heterosexual marriages are concerned because there's been a lot of same-sex acting out. And so, wives understandably want to know, who is my husband, gay or not? And that's one of those very painful questions that there's often not a clear answer to, and kind of time will tell. And so I think it's just, that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but it's a mixed bag. So I think there's, in most cases that we see, guys are just acting out as a result of their addiction. In other cases, it's a more longer standing pattern. So it just really depends on history and how it shapes up.
I put a link to a book called "Is My Husband Gay, Straight, or Bi" by a guy named Joe Court.
Yeah.
It's a great book for people in this situation. Just ignore everything that Joe Court has ever said about sex addiction, because he is right on the wrong page when it comes to sex addiction. But he really gets sexual orientation. So if you want to read that book,
he's actually got a couple books I think on that topic, but that's the key book. I agree.
Yeah. My question is, usually I feel dysregulated when there's some conflict going on at work. Are there good books you recommend for dealing with difficult people that are an easy read? I don't know all the appropriate things to say when someone is having a hard time and taking their anger out on me. I try not to let others' trauma and anger affect me or take it personally, but I find sometimes I do, and I'm not sure what to communicate with them. I try to use empathy and facts, but I'm not sure what other skills I might use. I don't know if this is from an addict or betrayed partner, but I totally identify with you. And that was always a huge trigger for my addiction. I didn't know how to deal with these situations. And I don't know any good books. David, thoughts?
As you were talking, I was really running through in my head. There's communication skill kinds of stuff with the Center for Nonviolent Communication. I think has some interesting reads on that, but it's not exactly on this topic. I think one just by way of getting background information on this, the Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk might be helpful, because it kind of talks about how these reactions are kind of wired into us, and he talks about some ways to deal with that. So that would be one as kind of background information, but nothing comes off the top for me. I wish I could quickly think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe learning about imago therapy and how to do that, but you got to have two people to do that tango. I mean, you got to have two willing people to do that dance with imago.
Right.
The technique is useful.
Yeah, the books I can think of are more about kind of regulating ourselves, as opposed to dealing with a certain situation. But I understand what you're saying, because this can be very disturbing. Even if, any kind of traumatic history, when, if we had a father that yelled at us, and then if we have a spouse that yelled at us, we kind of can regress and kind of identify with that. And so I think these things are deep and old. And so these are deeply grooved patterns that I would be patient with yourself on. But I think your awareness is right on in terms of just, okay, I know what is happening, I know the circumstance, and now you're looking for solutions. And I think they're out there. I just don't have a good, easy to read book for you on that.
Yeah, we got a suggestion, Brene Brown's Dare to Lead, which I think that's a great suggestion.
Oh yeah, anything by Brene Brown, that's a great point. Good point. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take, we got time for one more here. What do you think of ETT, emotional trauma therapy, where they say they are able to change the addict's neural pathways so they are no longer addicted anymore? Could it actually work?
I'm not familiar with the specific protocols for emotional trauma therapy. And I believe in the power of changing different neural pathways, that we don't have to react in ways that we might have learned how to do to survive different traumatic experiences in our life. But I'm very dubious about changing any neural pathways that would result in the lifting of the addiction. I think addiction in many ways is almost a a natural part of our ecosystem. If we grow up in certain ways, it's a coping mechanism that's kind of has a function it's kind of well integrated. And I think we have to approach it as a behavioral disorder, and then we have to deal with the trauma and other things underneath that really drive it. But I'm cautious about anything that's just too easy like that, because I think certainly we have to change our neural pathways, certainly we have to change our thinking, but I don't know of anything that kind of miraculously changes the circumstance whereby we're addicted. So and again, I don't know that much about this, but just things like this that I've read about, I'm just kind of cautious, very cautious.
Yeah, I'm deeply skeptical. I'll take a step further, David. And we talk about this with arousal templates. I mean, neurons that fire together wire together. So we burn pathways in our brain. This happened, boom, we go here. We want to act out. And as we keep treading on these neural pathways, basically, they become, I'm using your metaphor, David, they become like superhighways. They become 8-lane superhighways. And that road's not going anywhere just because we're in recovery. Part of recovery is letting it get overgrown and start to crumble with weeds, but it's always there.
Exactly.
And we can find new little neuro pathways, that we can start taking a healthier path through our brain, so to speak. But that crumbling road, it may be in shambles, but it's always going to be there. I think once you're an addict, you're always an addict. You can't unbake a cake. You can't unpickle a pickle. We are what we are. Use whatever metaphor you want, but I'm just to take an addict and make them not an addict. I'm not buying that. To take an active addict and make them not an active addict, I think that's very doable. It happens all the time, but
same thing. I've seen trauma therapies. They say, okay, in one session, 1 2-hour session, I can cure all your trauma. I'm
not going to happen.
That as well. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. This was save these, bring them back. This was a great webinar. Thank you, David. Anything you want to say to take us out?
Just anything, just practice those grounding techniques in your daily life when you're feeling great, and that will really pay off when you have a bad day. They really do.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, and we'll see you then.
See you then, Scott.
Good night.
Take care. Bye-bye.